A key question studied by Phyllis's next guest is what makes someone risk their own life to save others. Dr. Eva Fogelman is an American psychologist, writer, filmmaker, and a pioneer in the treatment of psychological effects of the Holocaust on survivors and their descendants. She is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-nominated book, Conscience and Courage: Rescuers of Jews During the Holocaust. She is the writer and co-producer of the award-winning documentary, Breaking the Silence: The Generation After the Holocaust. Please stay tuned for an insightful and important discussion.
You are watching Profunda TV with host Phyllis Haynes.
Dr. Fogelman, it is a pleasure to interview you, and I am so grateful for your book. I am dedicating this program to Alex Pretti because your book addresses the very question, why do people help others or attempt to rescue others? As you know, Alex Pretti was trying to help a woman when he was shot and killed by ICE in Minneapolis. But he was attempting to help a woman who, according to the video that I saw, was attempting to help a woman who had been pushed. So I just really want to thank you for your book, Conscience and Courage. And it's an amazing work. And I think you've answered a question or attempted to answer a question: why do people risk their lives to help others? What made you write this book? Was it the story of your own father, who was a Holocaust survivor? What motivated you?
Before I did the work on the rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust, I had already been doing research on the psychological impact of the Holocaust on survivors, child survivors, second generation. And when I was a graduate student in social and personality psychology at the Graduate Center of City University of New York, there was a man by the name of John Slauson at the American Jewish Committee who had, in the late 1940s, done a study on the authoritarian personality. There was tremendous fear in America that what had happened in Europe and the rise of Nazism and the subsequent Holocaust might happen in America. And so John Slauson was interested in, is there an altruistic personality that's the opposite of the authoritarian personality? So he commissioned the study when I was still a graduate student. And this was in 1981. In 1981, Holocaust research was not really focusing on why non-Jews rescued Jews during the Holocaust. It was more, it began with the studies of the persecutors, with the Nuremberg trials, and then work with the victims. And so this was really the beginning of trying to understand what made these individuals risk not only their own lives, but also their children's lives, other family members' lives. And as a social psychologist, I look at three things. One is the socialization, how they grew up in their families, what values did they learn at home, what relationships did they have with people who took care of them, and then their personalities. And in addition to that is, how does the socialization, their personality, and the situation fit into to all these factors combined together, the interaction of all of them. So, for example, in the case when we talk about Minnesota, when they try to rescue the women from ICE, it was a daredevil kind of rescue that couldn't happen. ICE was right there. there was no real opportunity that was going to succeed. So one of the things that we have to remember during the Holocaust is that the rescuers of Jews were not daredevils. They weren't taking a risk in which they somehow thought maybe they will be able to succeed. So there were different motivations that people had for why they rescued Jews during the Holocaust.
Well, I think we're splitting hairs too much at the beginning. I want you to tell the story about the Russian baker who saved your father. Let's figure out, let's tell that story so people understand the atmosphere. Because the New York Times says what's brilliant about your book is that you tell about the horror, but you also tell about the rescue. So tell us the story about your father and how he was saved.
Sure. My father was in the Polish army before World War II began, and then the Polish army disbanded, and he escaped to Belarus, where we had some relatives. So he lived under the Russians for 2 years, working as a baker. When the Germans came in June of 1941, they had all kinds of laws against Jews having any kind of human rights. In March of 1942, they intercepted Jews early in the morning, whether they were going to work. They had every 1,500 Jews from a small town called Ilya had to appear with gold and other valuable possessions that they had to appear in the town square. When they got to the town square, there was a hole that was in the ground, and they were all shot into the ground. And they had to strip their clothes first, and then they were shot into the ground. By 12 o'clock, 1,500 of Ilya's Jews were killed, and then they set them on fire. My father had gone to work very early in the morning, and so he missed the whole evacuation of the Jews into the town square. And his Russian supervisor shooed him up into the attic, and my father was able to see what was going on. When the Germans finished their operation, they ran into the bakery and they said, "Do you have Jews here?" And the Russian supervisor said, "No Jews here." And they had left. And so that's how my father survived the first massacre. He then was put into a ghetto with a few other people. They needed like shoemakers, doctors, dentists. And then there was another massacre. My father escaped into the woods. And when he was in the woods, it got very cold towards the winter. And he used to live in a ditch with a friend that he met also along the way. And they would cover themselves up with moss. They had berries to eat. And every few days, they would knock on a door and get some milk and bread that lasted a couple of days. And they knew they couldn't survive the winter. And my father's friend knew somebody who was in the partisans. And so they approached him and said, "Could you get us into the partisans?" You needed a gun in order to get into the partisans, which my father didn't have. But because my father had been in the Polish army and had experience in how to fix guns and use guns, he was allowed into the partisans, and he fought against the Germans almost till the very end of the war. Then there weren't enough partisans, and so he joined the military police of the Red Army and was a guard of one of the generals. And then during liberation, he went to Berlin because he knew a lot of languages, and then had to bribe his way out, and eventually wound up in a DP displaced persons camp in Germany.
Where you were born in a displaced
Yes, I
persons
was
camp.
born in Kassel. I was born in Kassel.
So, but let's go back to that baker. So here's the man. What what is the motivation that you found of people who saved Jews? Was there some blanket personality quality?
Yes, well, one is that these individuals were able to sustain a lot of anxiety. They did not experience a disequilibrium. When they also had to learn they had a personality where they had to learn how to act. They had to role play. And for example, if you were rescuing small children and the children would be crying, or you had diapers on the line and you weren't pregnant. So women would make believe that they were pregnant in order for the neighbors not to be suspicious that they were rescuing a small child. Also, they had to have a sense of competence and independence. So they had to feel like they indeed were going to survive. And they had to have tremendous sense of independence. By that, I mean that they did not go along with the Nazi propaganda, that the Jews called all the ills of society in terms of the economic downfall, that they spread diseases, that they were cheating people in terms of their economics. And these individuals who became rescuers were able to see the Jews as human beings just like themselves. And this is where we get into the socialization. Most of the rescuers had a tolerance and acceptance of people who were different from them. And also they learned a sense of independence and competence from their parents. So for example, I have a Jean Kowalik in my book. She was a Ukrainian rescuer. She was very short because she had a respiratory disease. And one time she went to a concert with her father and she says, "Oh, I want to be a singer just like her." And her father said, "No, you're never going to succeed. You have to learn how to be able to support yourself." And she became a seamstress. And that's what enabled her to be independent for the rest of her life. And even though if you take a country like Poland, for example,
Well,
where
wait a
you
minute. Let's go back to her because you're telling her a story. So, was she a rescuer or a person who was rescued?
no, she was a rescuer. Jean Kowalik was in her early 20s. She lived with her mother in a small house that had one room and an attic and a little bit of land. And right not far from her, they built a ghetto. And there was a Jewish doctor in the ghetto who one time came and took care of her mother who was ill. And then he came to her and said, "Look, this ghetto is going to be liquidated. We're all going to be deported to a concentration camp. Can you save us? Can you save me?" And she said, "Sure." Meanwhile, he came one night and he brought 6 other people with him. And so she took 2 of the people and she sent them to her brother who lived a little further away from her. And so could you imagine, here she is, this tiny little girl with her mother, and having to feed all these people. And so she had some she had some ration cards, but she couldn't, knowing that the butcher and the grocer knew there were only 2 of them there, she couldn't all of a sudden be buying food for more people. So it would take her all day. She'd go from town to town to try to get food to help to have enough food for the people. And she used to give some lessons in sewing. And all of a sudden, and so when she did that, the survivors would be up in the attic. And so you can imagine, oh, there was also like a love affair that happened and fighting and
All right. Well, we want people to read the book, but again, in your book and the praise about your book, they say you tell one of the most important stories about all the rescuers and their motivation. Certainly, you even mentioned Otto Schindler in your book. So, but you also got some criticism. Why were some Jews very critical of you talking about rescuers? What was the criticism?
Yeah, so you have to remember, I started in 1981, okay? And the fear amongst the survivors was that if I was going to highlight the rescuers, it was going to diminish all the humiliation, degradation, the persecution that the Jews had experienced. What they did not realize is that when you talk about the rescuers, and the risks that they took. And don't forget, there were many non-Jews who were killed, and their families were killed, and that the Nazis would take a family and would hang them all up in the town square to see. You see, this is what happens if you save a Jew. And so the Holocaust survivors did not realize that by talking about the rescuers, you're also talking about the persecution of the Jews.
Now, I found it fascinating that you write about this conversation about altruism not being a motivation for everyone. In fact, you write that Anna Freud did not agree with this idea that people were altruistic. She didn't believe in altruism. Can you talk a little bit about the disagreement about whether you have an altruistic motivation or not?
Sure. In psychoanalysis, when people do something, there is always an unconscious motivation for why you do something that people are not necessarily aware of, aware that that's indeed what they're doing. But when we think about the fact that the rescuers had to act instantaneously, and they were in a life and death situation, there wasn't a lot of time to think about or to have an unconscious that was operating at that time in terms of making that kind of a decision. And did some people have an unconscious motivation in some way? That was not as important as what actually motivated them. And what motivated these individuals is a sense for the most important for the largest group of people I had was their morality. This was the right thing to do. I could not live with myself knowing that these people were going to die. And morality comes from three different motivations. It's either a morality that is much more cognitive, it's the right thing to do, it's the just thing to do, or it's a more emotional morality. I feel a sense of pity, I feel a sense of compassion for these individuals. And the third morality is a religious morality. And this is what God, wants me to do. This is, the Christian way to be towards another human being. But we also have Muslims who were also rescuers of Jews for example, in countries like Albania.
I don't think people know that. And that reminds me of a recent act of heroism that happened on a beach in France, where a Syrian man rescued an attacker to the ground to try to save people who were being shot. This brings tears to my eyes because I think people don't realize how much humanity there is in all of the groups. There are good people and there are bad people. We have to get over this idea that one group is bad and one group is good, but that's another conversation for another show.
Well, but you're saying the most important thing. So the most important thing that I learned from the rescuers, and when you do research, you have all kinds of different percentages. More than 90% of the people learned a tolerance and acceptance of differences from their parents. And that this is the most important thing that we have to learn from the rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust. And this is why they are such important role models. They did not go along with the propaganda. And because they had a sense of, the reason that they were able to have a sense of independence is that they grew up in loving homes. When they did something wrong, their parents didn't hit them. Their parents tried to explain to them what they did. So it was more a didactic kind of growing up. rather than, so they didn't grow up with a fear of authority. And what we have today and what we have so much hatred is indeed because we have this fear of authority. And this is what we have to get away from so that people can begin to think independently and see each other as human beings.
Well, you had a close friend, you told me, a person I got to interview years ago was a man named Stanley Milgram. And Milgram did some experiments. If you would be willing to describe, rather than having me describe the experiments, you could describe Milgram's experiments because he doesn't agree with you. He thinks that people are motivated by authority, and that's the supreme thing. So tell me about
Yes,
Milgram's experience.
absolutely. So Stanley Milgram, I think, was also affected by the Eichmann trial that took place in 1961, where, all of a sudden you have, Eichmann's, saying, I was just following orders. And so what Stanley Milgram did is he did an experiment in a laboratory. At that time, he was at Yale. He advertised for people that he was doing an experiment. And so certain people became subjects and other people became part of the experiment. So those people who became part of the experiment were supposed to be, scientific, doctors wearing a white coat. And then
People of authority.
Exactly. So that gave them a sense of authority. And then they had in a separate room, somebody, another subject comes in and they're asked nonsense kind of words. And every time they get it wrong, they have to press a button that increases electric shocks. And what he found is that about 61%, so we're talking about 2/3 of the people, obeyed the authority, and they continue to shock. Obviously, it wasn't a real shock, but they continued to shock the person. 61%. So what you see is that individuals obey authority. There were other people who said, "I can't do this. I can't do this." And then
I just in defense of Milgram, I want to say that he used actors to pretend that they were being shocked, correct? He didn't really shock people, but the people who were pushing the buttons, who believed that they had the right to
they
push
had
and
to
deliver shock,
obey the authority.
they
Absolutely.
thought they were really hurting people and still went along with the
Yes.
instruction to do it.
Because of the authority. And that's why you can see why these rescuers are such special people, that they, despite knowing that they could be killed for what they're doing, they still felt that, they weren't going to go along with the malevolent authority.
Well, let's take this to you also in your book, start talking about modern day rescuers. One of the references you use in your book are the stories of Kuwaitis, people in Kuwait, who rescued Westerners during the Gulf War, that they took a risk to protect the people who were still in the territory of the Gulf. And you give examples of this. So is that your motivation to help people learn how to become more loving and concerned about the care of others? What's driving you to still talk about this subject?
Well, it's to have an antidote to the kind of heroes that young children today are being subjected to. Young children today are being subjected to super sports people, to super actors and actresses, to our billionaires, to our entrepreneurs who are making gazillions of dollars, and what I want to show young people today is that, we need a new kind of hero. And those are the kinds of heroes in terms of how you treat another human being. And that's, that's my motivation. And I hope that more young people will embrace the rescuers, will learn about them. We have to remember also that it was a very small group of people who were able to do that. When we're talking about 700 million people were living under German-occupied countries in Europe and Northern Africa, what we're talking about is a very small percentage. Today, at Yad Vashem, the 2022 statistics have like a little more than 28,000 individuals. Clearly, there were many more. Because don't forget, you had networks of rescue. We mentioned just one of the motivations, which was moral motivation. There were other motivations that motivated people. And one of them was the relationship that people had with individuals. So, for example, when we talk about the Russian baker supervisor that helped my father, he had a 2-year relationship with my father. He saw my father every day. And so it was that relationship that got him to risk his life to save my father.
I want to encourage people to read your book. It's a very important book, and I couldn't put it down. I thank you for Conscience and Courage by Dr. Eva Fogelman. You have more to say. This book deserves a documentary. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much, Dr. Fogelman.
Thank you, Phyllis, for giving me the opportunity to hopefully make a change in the kinds of people, young people today think about who should be a hero.